So with no further ado, then I'll call on Cody to introduce our guest for tonight.
Hey, it's my sincere pleasure to introduce Jeannie Economos. Jeannie has worked for over 35 years on issues that are close to all of our hearts: the environment, climate justice, peace and social justice for farm workers and other rural low-income minority communities, including indigenous people and migrants in Florida and around the country. Since 2007, Jeannie has been the Pesticide Safety and Environmental Health Project Coordinator for the Farmworkers Association of Florida, coordinating pesticide training for farm workers, identifying workplace violations of the worker protection standards, conducting healthcare provider training on pesticide and heat exposure of farm workers, and advocating for stronger workplace regulations and improving compliance and enforcement. She has also been engaged in community-based research with Emory University on the reproductive health of Florida farm workers and on heat stress exposure, and is actively engaged in local, state, national, and international coalitions, collaborations related to farm worker rights, health and safety, pesticide reduction, environmental health, and justice. In recent years, Jeannie has been involved in national policy issues, including agroecology, food sovereignty, regenerative agriculture, and social justice. These are vital issues to our environmental working group, and we're very interested in them all as we learn more about the Farm Bill before Congress this year. Please give a warm welcome to a champion of the environment, our soil's health, and fair treatment for all people, Jeannie Economos.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to sharing this presentation with you all today, and hopefully we can get the first slide. This is my passion. It's more than a job for me. It's a calling. It's my work, my mission in life, and I have no doubt that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be doing this work for social justice for farm workers. So I'm really thrilled to be here and very grateful to all of you for wanting to invite us to be a part of this meeting today. If we can get the PowerPoint presentation and get to the first slide. I do have I did shorten the presentation a little bit. I get very passionate about these things and can get very deep into it. So I look forward to sharing with you and then any discussion or questions afterwards. So were you able to find the PowerPoint presentation? I don't see the first slide up yet. So the title of the presentation today is What the Farm Bill Means to Farm Workers and the Future of Agriculture: How Injustice in Agriculture Impacts Climate Change. And I am the Pesticide Safety and Environmental Health Project Coordinator, and I'm really happy to share this with you and talk a little bit at the end about our organization. It all begins with food. We all have to eat, right? So this is a beautiful quote. I love this quote. In a garden, food arises from partnership. If I don't pick rocks and pull weeds, I'm not fulfilling my end of the bargain. But I can no more create a tomato or embroider a trellis in beans than I could turn lead into gold. That is the plant's responsibility and their gift, animating the inanimate. Now, there is a gift by Robin Waller Kimmerer. And if you haven't read the book Braiding Sweetgrass, I highly recommend it. So food, we all have to eat, right? Food is converted energy from sunlight, plus organic matter from the soil, plus fresh water, hopefully clean water, delivered seasonally through the water cycle, plus seeds from past generations. And all that food on the left-hand side looks beautiful and yummy. And but there's more behind that food than meets the eye. What is invisible in our agricultural system and what people often don't even recognize or think about are the farm workers, the people behind our food system. These are not farmers, these are the farm workers that have been invisible for too long. And who are farm workers? They're mostly Black and brown people of color. They were historically African-American, people who had come, who were brought here as slaves from other countries. And then after slavery ended, they became indentured servants and sharecroppers. Today, most farm workers are Hispanic and Haitian in Florida, but they are people of color who work for some of the lowest wages. They have little formal education. Some of them have no English language proficiency. They're subject to sexual harassment, intimidation, discrimination, exploitation. And these are people that do some of the most important work in our country, harvesting the food that we all eat. Some of them are victims of labor trafficking. We get cases of that in our office. A lot of times they do not have access to childcare. They don't have benefits, no health insurance, no paid days off. They live in marginalized rural communities, and today they're often undocumented. Agriculture. Okay, we think of the traditional farm with the red barn and the husband and wife and the kids standing outside the barn, but the reality is much different. On the left-hand side, you see what is industrial agriculture today, and it's big corporate farms with lots of machinery. And the other option is agroecology, which is what our organization espouses. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But you can see the difference between the industrial agriculture on the left and agroecology on the right. And you can decide which one looks better and which one you prefer. What are these two different styles of agriculture? Well, industrial agriculture is large-scale production of commodity crops, usually corn, soy, and wheat, that use synthetic fertilizers and toxic pesticides to maximize production, even as it depletes the health of the soil. It's the product of our capitalist economy that promotes growth at all costs and concentrates power in the hands of a few large corporations. Ironically, the food that's the most healthy for us to eat, like the fruits and vegetables that we're all told we should be eating every day, they're called specialty crops. And the commodity crops are the corn, soy, and wheat that you find in almost everything, including lots of processed foods, and that are often made from GMO products and that are often not good for our health. Agroecology, on the other hand, is multifunctional agriculture that promotes social justice, food sovereignty, which we'll talk about later, local identity and culture, and economic viability. It produces foods in ways that promote human health and the health and sustainability of our social systems and our ecological systems. It uses natural pest management practices and used organic matter that is recycled, and it maintains soil health over generations. And the one thing about true agroecology, it's more than just not harming the soil. It's actually building and creating and restoring soil. It can actually restore damaged soils. What about industrial agriculture, our traditional or our conventional, I shouldn't say traditional, our conventional agriculture that we have today? The agriculture, the way it's corporate agriculture is operating today, it uses up 40% of the world's biocapacity. Think about that. It represents the largest threat to the world's biodiversity and ecosystem function. It poisons the biosphere and human health, some of the worst toxic chemicals, which is my thing, and I'm happy to talk about that at length. It uses fossil fuels for toxic pesticides and chemical fertilizer production that destroys beneficial organisms in the soil. And half the planet's population, there are about 1 billion small scale farms in the world. One of the things that's very frustrating to us is that in all the talk about climate change today, you keep hearing about car emissions and coal-fired power plants. But one of the biggest contributors overall to our climate change is our system of agriculture from beginning to end. If you look from extraction to disposal, agriculture in and of itself has one of the biggest footprints on climate change in the world. So the industrial food system today consumes 16 to 20% of all energy in the United States. Livestock, the way we do it now, is responsible for 50% of erosion and sediment in the country. It uses about 37% of the pesticides in agriculture, 50% of antibiotics, even though we have antibiotic resistance problems around the country and around the world, and 1/3 of nitrogen and phosphorus going into fresh water comes from the way we produce livestock in large animal feeding lots in industrial agriculture. So the industrial food system today includes livestock production. And again, this is big livestock production. It's 70% of all agricultural land is for major livestock production, and it's 30% of the land surface of the planet. More than 50% of US grain goes to feed livestock, and that's just not sustainable at the rate we're going. 10 to 16 pounds of grain is used to produce 1 pound of beef. And that is grain that could be used to feed communities, but even more, communities could use that land to feed themselves, to grow in traditional, ethnic, and healthy foods in their traditional ways. The industrial food system is good for agribusiness, but it's not good for real people and the earth. How do we change this? How do we pull up the roots of industrial agriculture? So industrial agriculture in the United States is rooted in the enclosure movement, which turned land that was stolen from indigenous communities into private property to the settlers. Our colonial agricultural system relied on plantation economies, which used enforced slave labor from Africa. And then the Green Revolution that started in the 1960s and was embraced by the DuPont myth of better living through chemistry. It sounds great. The Green Revolution sounds like it would be great, but actually it was the turning point that changed us from an agricultural system that was more sustainable to a big corporate industrial agriculture that is causing tremendous damage to the planet and to human health. So today, modern agriculture is very chemically dependent, and this is my area of work that I feel that I've seen so much on, and I'm happy to talk about that some more. Pesticides are fossil fuel based. Chlorpyrifos is we finally got it banned after 20 years of fighting against chlorpyrifos. The chemical was used for mustard gas in World War II. So some of these pesticides, after World War II, they were no longer used, and so they used them to create pesticides. Ammonium nitrate is used as a fertilizer that's also fossil fuel based. So we talk about fossil fuels being a problem for climate change, but a lot of these fossil fuels go into our agricultural system that people don't realize in terms of pesticides and fertilizers. We also have an exploited labor force. It was enslaved Africans that became sharecroppers. And today we have a largely immigrant workforce, many of whom are undocumented. And that was on purpose, even though we talk about people decry undocumented workers now. It was an economic system that turned a blind eye to that because they needed cheap labor. Farm workers are not covered under the National Labor Relations Act or the Farm Labor Standards. They were excluded. It's called agricultural exceptionalism. The same agricultural exceptionalism that you might have heard on the news today that they're trying to use to overturn child labor laws to allow children to work in agriculture. So this is the kind of system that our system of agriculture is. It's a system that exploits people and the environment, and that's unsustainable. We also have heavy subsidies by the US government, without which the current corporate system would fail. And so this is taxpayer dollars that are propping up corporate agriculture. What is the difference between that and agroecology? Well, agroecology is an ancient system, but it's also a modern scientific discipline that includes ecological science, but that also brings in indigenous and generational wisdom and ancestral practices. It's designed to increase agricultural yields while keeping ecosystems intact, but it also is a social movement. That is a shift from industrial agriculture to looking for systemic change in the entire agricultural system, to go from a corporate extractive system to one that is grounded in community, culture, and social justice. So while it is an agricultural practice, it's also not, it's inextricable from communities and culture and social justice, which our current system of agriculture is not. So it reforms the current system, and it changes the balance of power from big corporate entities to address the root causes of the problem and center the solutions in community and getting to the root of the problem. So we all eat. That's one of our common denominators. Everybody that is on the planet has to eat at some point or another. Some consumers are able to make choices to support better agricultural practices. They can support better labor standards, organic, pesticide-free produce that's climate friendly. But generally, to be able to do that, you have to have a higher income because these prices cost more. Not all people are able to do that. Niche markets are only available to some people, but they're not enough. We need an entire paradigm shift that reestablishes land and agriculture as community wealth rather than as a means for corporate profiteering. We need policy change that eliminates government subsidies of destructive chemical intensive practices. A lot of people think that this is not possible, but when you think about that big corporations are using government subsidies, our taxpayer dollars, and land to feed us in a way that is also poisoning our land and poisoning our health. And there's something wrong with that system. And if we're going to have a better climate and better health for the planet and ourselves, then we have to look at complete transformation of our entire agricultural system. You can see this picture. This is what industrial agriculture looks like. There's no biodiversity here. The land is stripped, the soil is stripped of its nutrients. Constant chemical inputs cause depletion of the soil. I learned several years ago that when the white man first came onto the North American continent, there were 6 feet of topsoil on the continent in North America. And today there's less than 6 inches of topsoil. That's how much we've eroded the soil. Also, the pesticides and the fertilizers that we put on the soil deplete the nutrients from the soil. And so we are hurting ourselves because food that is grown in an agroecological way actually has more nutrients in it. And so a lot of times industrial agriculture has to add inputs to this to so-called put nutrients in, but they're chemical nutrients and they're not natural from the soil. So what is the human impact? So agriculture, the way it is now, is a system that relies on toxic chemicals that harm people. This is from extraction. So we are extracting fossil fuels, oftentimes in low-income minority or indigenous Native American communities. So we are pulling fossil fuels out of the soil, and that has devastating impacts on the environment and the communities that surround them. Then we use those fossil fuels to produce chemical pesticides and fertilizers that we often store in, again, Black and brown and even white and often low-income communities where they're subject to disasters from the storage. Then we apply these pesticides, and you can see the picture of the woman here harvesting fruit. And she's exposed to pesticides. That's why she wears long sleeve shirts and a hat to try and protect herself from pesticides. And then we have all these chemicals that have to be disposed of someplace. And where do they get disposed? So these are all big questions and big concerns for our environment and our health. Fertilizers are derived from natural gas, which requires fracking and pipelines all across the country. And we've heard multiple times about these pipelines rupturing and causing terrible problems in the environment. Most pesticides are hydrocarbons that are derived from petroleum. So these are the things that people don't see behind the agricultural system, that it's based on fossil fuels. And if we're talking about climate change, we have to talk about agriculture's impact by using all these fossil fuels for the agricultural system. So we have the impacts of gas and oil extraction, and they include contaminated groundwater, methane leaks, and methane is one of the biggest single contributors to climate change. Methane is something like 20 times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. We have exposure to toxic chemicals used in the fracking process. And we have displacement of people and land stolen from people because companies come in and want to frack on their land or want to build oil wells on their land. So workers in extractive industries and communities living at their fence lines are the most impacted. This is a picture of an oil well by a school, but this is mild. If you go to Houston, and I'm sure some of you have been there, you will see huge, massive oil refineries mixed in with homes. I will never forget going there and seeing children playing soccer in a field that was surrounded by these massive oil refineries and breathing this toxic air while they were out there playing soccer. So this is what we're dealing with. So production and storage. Fertilizer production releases ammonia, which can cause long-term damage to the lungs, eyes, and skin. Fertilizer storage facilities are highly explosive. There were incidents in West Texas, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Beirut, Lebanon. These highly toxic chemicals are used in pesticide production and are responsible for the Bhopal incident in India in 1984, which was the worst pesticide incident ever in the history of the world. And it was DuPont at that time. There was an explosion of pesticides and it killed over 500,000 people. And today, the company has still not become responsible, and there are still people suffering from the long-term consequences of that pesticide accident in Bhopal, India. Both workers in these industries and the communities nearby these facilities are the most impacted. So this is a picture of a fertilizer plant in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and you can see what the devastation looks like. So pesticides can be extremely toxic to farm workers and their family. They don't get protective equipment, they don't get adequate training, and they have abusive employers. Pesticide residue bioaccumulates in our bodies, in the soil and in the water, even thousands of miles from the site of application. Fertilizer runoff pollutes our waterways, creates algae blooms, and leads to high levels of nitrates in the water, which are toxic to both humans and animals. And this is a farm worker applying pesticides. And would you want to eat that? I'm not sure what that is, if that's grapes there or what, but would you want to eat that after seeing it sprayed like that? And you can see how the worker is dressed, although he doesn't have gloves on, so his hands are getting exposed. So agrochemicals are an environmental injustice issue. The communities most impacted are those that are at the site of extraction and pipelines, and fence line emissions from facilities where toxic chemicals are produced, and then farm workers have occupational exposure to pesticides. So every step of the way, Black and Indigenous and Latino communities are adversely impacted by these chemicals. And you can see the woman's hands on the right-hand side. And this just shows some of the worst chemicals, some of the pesticides, and it shows the levels of exposure. We can send this PowerPoint to you and you can take a look at that a little bit more, but you can see some of these pesticides and how they impact various communities. So agrochemicals are a climate justice issue. Industrial agriculture contributes to climate change through changes in land use. So that's massive deforestation for industrial farms, emissions from farms and confined animal feeding operations, which create a huge amount of toxic pollution and contribute to climate change. The life cycle of agrochemicals is another issue. The transportation of food. So some of us, get our food from California instead of locally. The refrigeration process, the packing process, farm equipment and machinery, all of these are contributing to climate change. Chemical feedstocks of agrochemicals are often also components of other chemicals, so it's hard to determine exactly how much is from the agricultural industry. Climate change impacts agriculture and the people involved in it. So climate impacts droughts, floods, increased numbers of pests, and native species are disrupted by invasive pests. And the only solutions to these is that industry is offering more and more chemicals to try and address these problems. and it disproportionately impacts farm workers who work long hours. In Florida, we see farm workers exposed to high heat and hurricanes. In California, we saw what it was like with farm workers exposed to wildfires. We saw the wildfires in Canada this past week and how people were told to stay inside. If you're a farm worker, you can't stay inside. You have to go outside and work and breathe that smoke while you're harvesting fruits and vegetables. Climate change also increases the potential for disasters at agricultural and agrochemical facilities, and these put us at even greater risk. And when we have these disasters at agrochemical plants, then that just releases more carbon dioxide and other chemicals into the air, which again just exacerbates climate change. So this is a global justice issue. Marginalized communities worldwide are being forced to adopt industrial practices by big ag. Local food economies are displaced in favor of industrial crops with chemical inputs and for a global commodity market. Pesticides that are banned in the United States are often then sold to other countries, poorer countries, without any kinds of protections or notification about how dangerous these pesticides are. US corporations fail to take accountability for even the most egregious chemical harms perpetuated in other countries. For example, Dow Chemical, Dow Chemical wasn't DuPont, it was Dow Chemical in the Bhopal disaster incident in India. Okay, so our moment is now. We have opportunities in the Farm Bill to make a difference. The Farm Bill is so important. Every 5 years, Congress reauthorizes the Farm Bill. It's a wide-ranging piece of legislation that affects every part of our system, even though there is nothing in the Farm Bill that specifically addresses labor. One of the things that we're working on is to try and get that changed for the next Farm Bill. The Farm Bill should reflect your values and build on actions to reduce economic inequality, bridge the nation's racial divide, end hunger, confront the climate crisis, improve nutrition and food safety, and protect farm workers and communities. Some of our priorities for the Farm Bill are right here. Our priorities include centering racial justice, because if we center racial justice, we're going to be protecting all of us. We want to end hunger, and that includes for undocumented workers in this country who are doing some of the hardest work in this country for low pay, and right now against horrible anti-immigrant sentiment and legislation. Our priority is to meet the climate crisis head on. And as I said earlier, we believe that agriculture is both one of the biggest contributors to climate change and has the biggest potential to mitigate climate change, because healthy soils sequester carbon at a rate something like 10 times higher than damaged industrial agriculture soils can sequester carbon. So if we can transform the way we do agriculture, we have a huge opportunity to begin to mitigate the effects of climate change. We also believe in increasing access to healthy food, and that includes for some of the most low-income people of color, but for all of us, because we all deserve healthy food. We want to ensure the safety and dignity for food and farm workers. We want to protect small farmers and consumers, because as I'm sure you probably have heard, small farmers are and small farms are being lost at a terrifying rate. The average age of farmers today, I think, is over 50 years old. And a lot of older farmers try to give their land to they hope that their siblings will, that their children will take over the farm and continue farming. But it's so hard that so many young people will not go into farming, and we are losing small farms around the country. We also want to ensure the safety of our food supply. And if you care about food security, then you want to care about our food supply, and corporate agriculture is not the solution. So these are some of our priorities. We prioritize community food sovereignty. Most people will talk about food security, but we believe in going way beyond food security. We believe food sovereignty gives control of the food system back in the hands of the people. Right now, we give our power to big corporate agriculture because we don't have access to land. We don't have control over what is grown. Big corporate agriculture, you go to the store and you don't have a choice. You might say, oh, look at these 5 varieties of tomato. Isn't that great? When there's hundreds of varieties of tomato and we don't get a chance to choose those. Corporate agriculture decides for us. So we believe in food sovereignty, and I can talk about that some more as well. Our other issue is to address the historical and continual inequities faced by indigenous people, small farmers, Black farmers, Hispanic farmers, and farm worker communities. The founder of our organization was a farm worker, and he used to say, farm workers are just landless farmers. There are people that don't have access to land, but if they had access to land, they themselves would be farmers. The lack of access to land is what keeps them from doing their own farming. We also believe in protecting workers against exploitation, violence, and harm to their health. Another of our priorities is to redirect funding through the crop insurance and commodity programs to provide incentives and reward farmers, small farmers, for employing safer, sustainable, and regenerative climate resilient practices. There's an excellent book, and at the end of this, I can put it in the chat so everybody can share it. It's called Freedom Farmers. I've been working with farm workers for about over 25 years. And until I read that book, I did not know about the history of Black farmers. Black farmers in the United States were doing organic agriculture and sustainable agriculture before there was a word for it. We need to go back and learn those and give them access to land, give indigenous people access to land so that they can use these regenerative agricultural practices that so much of us have lost. And the last one of our priorities is to eliminate support for industrial scale livestock operations that are causing so much damage to our health and to our environment and to the workers. How does food sovereignty relate to climate change? 1/2 of the world's population is rural. You don't see that in the United States, but worldwide, it's about 1/2 of the population. There are about 1 billion small scale or peasant and indigenous farms globally, and that number is drastically reducing because of corporate takeover. Small scale farms require little energy or fossil fuel, and they use little, if any, farm inputs such as petroleum-based fertilizers and pesticides. I have farm workers that come to me and they did farming in their home countries in Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and they said that they never use pesticides or fertilizers in their home countries. And they come here and they get into working on farms and they're exposed to all these chemicals and they're not used to it, and they're really surprised to see all these chemicals that are being used on farms here. Plus, small scale farming has the potential to sequester carbon naturally by also producing food in a way that's sustainable and healthy. So agriculture can be a solution, but only if we actively shift power away from fossil fuel, chemical, and industrial agriculture corporations and into the hands of local communities. So this is one of the things we believe, that the biggest hope for mitigating harm and averting the climate catastrophe relies on fundamental changes to the system that produces our food. Not only can agricultural production that's done well cease to contaminate people and the environment, but agroecological practices can support healthy, economically vibrant communities and mitigate climate change. So I love this picture. This is called the Three Sisters. The top part of it got cut off. But this is just one example of what can be done and a way to do agriculture right. That one picture you saw of miles and miles of commodity crops and machinery, where they're doing monoculture, monocropping. This is an ancient practice that's used in Central America and Mexico. It's called the Three Sisters. First, you plant corn and on the same land, and corn grows tall. And after the corn has started to grow, then you plant beans around the corn. And beans are a nitrogen fixing. They put nitrogen in the soil, and the beans are a vine, so they can climb up the stalks of the corn naturally. Then around that, you plant squash. Squash is a natural ground cover, so you don't have to spray for weeds because the squash will grow and shade out the weeds. So you're growing 3 crops on the same piece of land where you have biodiversity and you protect from pests because you have different plants there. And because you're using the beans, you are actually putting nitrogen into the soil naturally without having to buy chemical fertilizers. This is just one example. In Idaho, several years ago, they used mustard greens, and they grew mustard greens and composted them and used them as a natural pesticide. They put the mustard greens over the soil, and it killed bad organisms, and they were able to grow. So there are all kinds of things. Instead of spending all this money on research into more chemicals and more pesticides, we can be spending research into these alternative kinds of methods of practicing agriculture that are sustainable and healthy and make much more sense than polluting our land and soil and water and ourselves. And I love this picture because this just shows all the varieties of corn that there could be, so much more than the varieties that conventional agriculture gives us to choose from. And this shows the 3 sisters, the corn, the beans, and the squash, and just how much variety there could be rather than just waiting for what the agricultural industry feeds us. And so we say, just say no to false solutions. So you might have heard about all these carbon capture schemes and ideas for agriculture, for climate change. And we don't believe in that. And I can get into that in more detail if we have time for discussion. Carbon capture sounds good, but it's actually a windfall for investors. It's a law. There's this, see this link here? Please check out that article in Mother Jones magazine, because it talks about how big corporate billionaires are using carbon capture money from the federal government to get rich and actually contribute to the climate crisis while they act like they're helping it. It's a long story. It would take too long to get into, but if you read that article, I highly recommend it. There's also a really good film and a manual or a booklet called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. And again, I highly recommend that you read that as well. So we oppose the Growing Climate Solutions Act because that also is about carbon capture. The bills that we support are the Agricultural Resilience Act and the Climate Stewardship Act. Don't let the names fool you. Growing Climate Solutions sounds good, but that is one that we oppose. But the Agricultural Resilience Act and the Climate Stewardship Act are 2 bills that we support. So our organization is a 40-year-old statewide grassroots community-based organization. We have 5 offices in Florida and over 10,000 Haitian, Hispanic, and African American members who work in various industries. And you can read our mission and vision there, but we build power among rural communities to address social, political, economic, workplace health, environmental, and climate justice issues. And our vision is a world where farm workers are appreciated and acknowledged, but really our vision is a world where we have equity and a healthy environment and dignity for all people and for the planet. So these are the bills that we support, and I'm not going to read them all, but you can share them. A big one for us is the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, and that's I could talk for a long time about that as well. So thank you very much, and I just wanted to show you the last picture. If you want to go to so this is a picture of our community garden. You can see it's multi-ethnic, and this is some of the fruits of our community garden in Fellsmere. And so it can be done where people come together and work with each other to build a healthy food system. I know I didn't talk a whole lot about the Farm Bill specifically, but I do have things that I can put in the chat to share with you about a little bit more detail about what we're asking specifically from the Farm Bill. But if there's time, I am very much open to questions and discussion and comments. And I really appreciate this opportunity because I feel really strongly and passionately about this. And I'm very happy to share this with all of you. So thank you. I'm going to go on mute now. Thanks.
Jeannie, if you could put on your video, because we'd all like to see you and we chat with you, and we'd like to thank you very much for a terrific presentation. There's too much information there for us to absorb. I guarantee you that. But if you can provide us with background, we can disseminate a lot of that information and work with it, and we appreciate it. And I don't know if you know or not, but I would be proud to tell you that our group was instrumental in starting what we called Green Path Veterans Farm, which was an organic community-based farm. And it's still in operation. The name has changed, and we are not in charge of that anymore, but we certainly got it started, and now it's Operation EcoVets. So a
Oh,
lot of the
wow.
things that you're suggesting, we were doing about, I forget how many years ago it was, but it was a lot.
That's
And,
fantastic. I would love to know more about it. If you could send me information about it, I would love to know about it. That's great. That's excellent.
Sure. And I'll start out the questions. Number one, could you give us some examples of the subsidies that go to corporate agriculture?
Well, all the commodity crops are highly subsidized by the federal government. So not only in crop insurance, but also just they prop up the prices for soy, corn, and wheat. I don't know the exact numbers. I don't have them memorized, but that's why it's heartbreaking to me to think that that broccoli, kale, beans, all of those things that were supposed to, oranges, apples, those are considered specialty crops. They don't get the same subsidies that corn, wheat, and soy get from the federal government. And yet these are the healthy crops that we're supposed to be eating. I've been in meetings with farmers who are decrying the fact that they can't survive because it's so hard. They are much more they're subject to the weather and the rain and the rainfall, and yet they don't get the federal subsidies that these commodity crops get. And yet they're doing the most important work. And they also rely more heavily on labor. So like the commodity crops, corn, soy, and wheat, they are mechanized. So they have very low labor costs. And your oranges, apples, broccoli, cauliflower, celery, that's all hand harvested. So they have to pay labor costs. And when prices for fertilizer and pesticides go up, farmers have to cut costs somewhere. So they end up cutting it on labor, which is really unfair to the workers. So basically the whole system is skewed. If workers that are doing this hard work have to get the subsidies should go to the specialty crops rather than the commodity crops, because the people that are harvesting those crops should be getting a decent wage, and they're not. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, I hope there's some provisions in these farm bills that can address that issue, because that's clearly an important issue. I mean,
Yes.
the subsidies may be going to the wrong place.
Absolutely, but you have to also understand how powerful the agricultural industry is. That's why in the 1930s, the agricultural industry made farm workers exempt from labor laws that protected all other workers. The agricultural industry is extremely powerful in this country, and so it's hard to do. But I will drop some things, and I'm not good at multitasking. If I don't get them in the chat,
Don't do it now. You can do it later, and we'll
okay. Okay.
disseminate it.
Okay, thanks.
And then one thing that I read that's curious, and almost couldn't believe this, but you would probably know. And I read, and this was just a couple of weeks ago, that there's a dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River that's apparently caused by pesticides and other pollution that is now the size of the state of Connecticut.
Yes,
Is that correct?
yes, it is, unfortunately. The Mississippi River flows down from the Midwestern states where the commodity crops are grown. And all those pesticides and fertilizers are dumped all the way up from the Midwestern states, and it flows all the way down this gets me really upset. It flows all the way down the Mississippi River, and then you come through Louisiana, and then it picks up more pollutants from it's called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where you have all the oil refineries, and all that gets dumped into the Gulf of Mexico at the at the mouth there of the river. And yeah, things can't live there. There's a pesticide called methyl bromide, and it's a fumigant. It's luckily been banned, but they used it for decades, and now they just have a different kind of fumigant. It's actually called a soil sterilizer, because basically when you use methyl bromide or these other fumigants, they kill everything in the soil. I could go on about this, but they put plastic over the soil and they inject the pesticide under the plastic, and they leave the plastic there until everything in the soil is dead. So just think about, that means all the good beneficial insects and all the good beneficial bacteria, the worms that are supposed to be so good for the soil, they kill everything in the soil. Well, that stuff all gets into the river and flows down and goes into the, into the Gulf and into our oceans. And just a very quick thing, many, many years ago when we had a methyl bromide campaign, I talked to somebody she had retired, so she wouldn't go on the record, but there was bromine in the water in Miami-Dade County, which she suspected was from the use of methyl bromide. So it's affecting our water as well. One of the reasons they finally banned chlorpyrifos, which is a very long story, was not because they cared about farm workers, unfortunately, but because they found it in our drinking water. So you're talking about clean drinking water. Well, I hope that they address pesticides too, because we're all getting pesticides in our drinking water.
Wow, that's really creepy, Jeannie. Cody, I'm sure you have questions and comments.
No, I don't have any questions. I'm just absorbing all the information that Jeannie has given us. And this is very helpful to our environmental group who's working on the Farm Bill, because Jeannie's pointing us in the right direction, and the policies that have to change. Perhaps at the top is taking the subsidies away from the commodity crops and making sure that those resources get to incentivize farmers for farming the right way and restoring the soils and storing carbon. And there's a lot of equity issues too. It's very informative, Jeannie, and it's good for our membership to hear all these things, because the Environmental Working Group is, under Marshall's leadership, is working to try to figure out what we're going to do to inform people and try to do what we can as an organization to get the right stuff in the Farm Bill.
Well, just so you know, they pushed the deadline back. It was June 9th, which was this past Friday, but they pushed it back till this Friday. You have an opportunity to submit comments to the portal, to this, I think it's the House, maybe it's the House Ag Committee. And I'll send it to you in a separate email, because I can't multitask very well while I'm doing this.
Yeah, if you would, that'd be great. A lot of us already have sent input to the committee, but it'd be good to now open it up to our membership now that people know more about it.
That's great. That's great.
Jeannie, one thing that might help, are there any friendly Florida legislators that we could communicate with?
Oh, well, I wish I knew some. I mean, in the state legislature, or
I'm thinking more of the federal level for the Farm Bill.
Maxwell Frost has been good in Central Florida. He's been good. Again, I'll send you a list of those, because there are several that have been, more, what's her name? Debbie Wasserman Schultz has been better.
Yes.
And there's been several others, but I'll send you a list of those that have been helpful. Also, Darren Soto, I was a little disappointed in him, because he was being influenced. He would be a really good one to work on, because he was in a listening session with a bunch of farmers, and they were really pushing him in the other direction. So I think it would be really good to work on Darren Soto. I think he needs to hear from people, because he heard too much from the farmers' point of view of things at this big listening session that they had in Newberry. So I would really work on him.
You'll be interested to know that we tried to communicate with the Florida Farm Bureau about this topic, and they would not talk to us.
That does not surprise me at all. They will not talk to us. Nope. Does not surprise me at all. I would be surprised if they did talk to you. Mhm.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat or the question and answer. So Cody, unless there's anything more, we'll let Jeannie go. She's made such a fantastic presentation, and I'm sure she's tired from that. That was a lot of information.
Well,
Oh,
I
Jean.
really appreciate this, and I'm really excited about your group. I just think it's really awesome. I want to learn more about it, and hopefully I can maybe join other meetings, but I just really applaud you all, and I'm excited to hear what you're doing, and hopefully we can communicate and collaborate more in the future. So
We
kudos to all of you.
We certainly will, and please consider joining as a supporter and encourage your friends to do so too.
Awesome. Will do. Will do.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Jeannie.
Nice to meet
Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks, Jeannie.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, unless there's any further announcements, then Rich, we'll adjourn the meeting.